Welcome to Homemade's very first webinar. We're very glad you could join us. I'm Sam Pinney. I've been at the company for 5 years and look after our account managers here at Homemade alongside a couple of other teams. This is the first in a series of webinars designed around topics we know our landlords are keen to learn more on. We're going to start with the key topic of compliance. Format is simple. I'm going to hand over to our compliance expert, Rachel Harris, who will run through a few things compliance with us. Then we'll do a Q&A, which is your chance to ask all of those burning questions that you have. So let's hand over to Rachel.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome again, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. So firstly, let me introduce myself. I've worked in the industry now for about 7 years. 3 of which have been at Homemade. I've done a variety of operational roles, always with a focus on compliance. And here at Homemade, I oversee our team who look after new move-ins, renewals, and also in-tenancy property management. I'm very excited to introduce you to our complete guide to compliance, especially as in the last 7 years, rules and regulations have changed quite drastically. So let's go. So we're here to discuss the importance of compliance for landlords and also your renters, and provide you with key information to ensure that you are compliant and following the correct procedures. First and foremost, we will cover off pre-move-in renter checks. So there is a pretty much infinite list of things you have to check off and ensure are in place before you allow a tenant to pick up the keys and move into their new home. We're going to go through some of the elements of that checklist and give you the key highlights. We'll also cover off legally defined documentation. So what are the key documents that you need to serve on your renters to protect you later should you need to take any kind of legal action or any processes in relation to the tenancy. For each area, we'll cover off key considerations. So we've gone through it and we've extracted the key things that you will want to bear in mind for each area of compliance. Okay, first and foremost with our pre-move-in renter checks, we'll talk about right to rent and then referencing. Let's go. So right to rent, this is a really important area of compliance. It was brought in as part of the Immigration Act, and it's an area that carries pretty hefty penalties, so it's very important to get this right. What it means for you. So as a private landlord, and if you're using an agent or a company like Homemade, you're legally required to check the immigration status of anyone who's living in the property. So whether they are a tenant, whether they're someone that's permitted to live at the property as part of the agreement, or anyone that essentially exceeds that definition of a guest, you would need to make sure that they have the right to rent within the UK. The check generally involves 2 steps. So you will need to check one of the documents you see here on the screen, and you will also need to verify that the person you are meeting matches that document that you have seen. Post-COVID, there was actually quite a significant upgrade to the right to rent legislation, meaning that some of these checks can be carried out remotely or with the support of identity service providers. And we can go into further detail about that maybe in a future webinar. So you must keep the proof of your right to rent check on file. For those renters who may have a time-limited right to remain in the UK, you must also ensure you're doing that check no sooner than 28 days before the start of the tenancy. So those are kind of some of the key highlights of right to rent. An additional thing I'd like to mention is that particularly with those renters who have a time-limited right to remain in the UK, you will need to conduct a follow-up check. You can see it here noted, point 4 on the slide here under the common misconceptions. You must ensure that you follow up to ensure they still have the right to remain in the UK. Similarly, if you have a renter who is not yet an adult when they move into the property, perhaps as the child of the tenant or a permitted occupier, as soon as that renter turns 18, the requirement to do a right to rent check is now kicked in. So for anyone that you're in doubt of their age, if they're kind of on the cusp of 18, have a look at their passport so that you can make a note of when their birthday is and check in with them for that right to rent check. So moving on now to referencing. So referencing is not a legal requirement, but it is an area of compliance for yourself as a landlord. So we're going to touch on it briefly here. So we'll talk about the different areas of referencing. First and foremost, credit checks. Particularly in 2023, we have seen a rise in how important it is to look at the credit record of your renter. That covers things like county court judgments, IVAs, records of bankruptcy, and unfortunately there has been a pretty big rise in the amount of these kind of things that we've seen as a result of referencing. So it just highlights for you as a landlord how important it is to take a look at those details from your renters. Once you've assessed their creditworthiness, you will then want to have a look at their income. So every deal, we like to say, is an exception. Every tenant is an individual, so their income is not always straightforward. You can have renters who are on temporary contracts, who are self-employed, who are on 0 hours contracts, and also obviously full-time employed. So you're going to want to get a sense of what their regular income is and ensure that it meets the affordability threshold for the property. You can do that in a variety of ways. So if you're going to use a professional referencing company, we do now have access to things like open banking, where you can simply check their account in a very secure way to see records of their previous income payments. And also, just to touch on there, you can see the outgoing rental payments if they have been a renter in the past as well. So it gives you that assurance that they have money coming in and they're paying their rent on time to whoever their current landlord is. You can also reach out directly to their employer, and that can give you that personal touch of knowing that you've spoken with the HR team or line manager, and that they've confirmed that individual has a regular income. So yeah, that was what we had to say with regards to referencing. And of course, everything I've mentioned here, you would also want to apply to a guarantor. We'll touch on guarantors later on in the presentation, but there's a lot to unpack there. But yeah, just for now to mention that although referencing seems overwhelming, it's a very important step to do with regards to your tenancy, and apply the same measure of checks to any guarantors as well as tenants.
Thanks for that, Rach. So a few questions off the back of that. First one, do I have to do the right to rent myself personally as a landlord?
So no, you don't have to do the right to rent yourself. But of course, if you're not controlling a process yourself, you want to make sure that it's been done to the standard that it needs doing and in line with the regulations. So a homemade or an equivalent letting company can conduct that check for you. But my advice would be to make sure that you do receive a record of that check, keep it on file, and that you're aware about whether any follow-up checks would be required.
Okay, cool. And so then following on from that, what about referencing in general? Is that something I need to do myself, or is that something that you guys should do?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different approaches. If you were going to conduct the referencing checks yourself, just make sure you follow the kind of guidelines that we've discussed today. If you are using homemade or an equivalent company, then I would definitely make sure that they are outsourcing it to an unbiased third party. The reason I mention that is because it would be a significant conflict of interest if homemade, for example, were carrying out the referencing checks in-house on renters that they had put forward to a landlord. We use a third-party company to ensure that there is no conflict of interest, and also to ensure that it's done to the high professional standard that we need with the volume of tenancies that we deal with.
Okay, makes sense. And then finally, how do you calculate the affordability for a renter?
Really good question. So the industry standard for calculating affordability is to take your monthly rent, times it by 30, and then that would be the pre-tax annual income that you'd be looking for from a renter. Just to mention that is an industry standard, and obviously with the variety of clients that we work with, we're quite accustomed to clients having their own levels of threshold that they would like to work towards as well, but times 30 is the industry standard.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rach.
Thanks for those questions, Sam. So we'll now move on to all of the legal documents you must hand over or serve on your renters before they take up possession of the property. First and foremost, we will talk about gas safety certification, then energy performance certificates, electrical safety certificates, the government how to rent guide, and then also the deposit registration documentation.
So starting with a gas safety certificate. So from my experience, this is the area of compliance that most landlords are very familiar with. So some of this will be things you've probably heard about before. The gas safety regulation means that as a landlord, you must ensure that all of the gas appliances, flues, pipework, etc. have to be safe so that your renters can live in the property safely. This is the check that must be completed every 12 months. It's a very quick check. Most plumbers, gas engineers will be able to carry this out for you. I would say it should cost no more than kind of £60 to £80, and it is a check that should take no more than kind of an hour within the property. It does carry pretty hefty criminal penalties, so it's a really important area to make sure that you first and foremost do before your renters move in, but also make sure that the 12-month follow-up check is conducted. It's pretty easy, I think, for most landlords to fail to diarise the expiry date, and you really don't want to go over that date at all. One thing you must do if you haven't used a gas engineer before is check that the individual is part of the gas safe register. So any gas safety certificate will have the reference number of the engineer contained within that certificate, or it will be on the engineer's website, or you can ask them for it before you engage their services. And then going on the register, you'll simply be able to take a look using that reference number and check that they are a fully qualified engineer and part of the gas safe register. This documentation, usually a one-page certificate, details whether the appliances are all safe to use. If the certificate is completed and any remedials are required, then that's usually detailed within the certificate as well, and this must be served on the renters before they move in. If you renew the certificate during the term of the tenancy, then you must make sure you again serve the new document on the renters within 28 days of its renewal. And that's pretty much it with regards to gas safety. So moving on now to energy performance certificates. So this area of compliance actually kicks in as soon as you're going to put the property onto the market. You must have the energy performance certificate available for any renters before they view the property. This makes a lot of good sense. Looking at how much you're likely to pay for your energy bills is something that really goes into that decision for a renter when deciding which property best suits them. So giving them that indication of what that looks like helps them make an informed decision even before they commit to viewing a property. If you don't have an EPC in place, it is very easy to get one. There are EPC assessors. It should cost you no more than £30 to get an EPC sorted, and it's a certificate that lasts you for 10 years. If you've recently purchased the property, there actually is an online register for EPCs. There should be one in place if you've recently purchased it. By simply entering the postcode onto the online register, you may be in luck and there may well be an EPC already in place for your property. As I say, the copy must be available before viewing. Usually that is a snapshot of purely the energy efficiency rating, so A, B, C, D, all the way through to G. But the full EPC must be provided to the renters before they move in, and you must have an exemption for your property if the minimum rating is not an E. And a really significant update to this area of compliance is due in 2025, where the minimum rating is going to jump up quite a lot from an E up to a C. So I would really advise taking a look at your EPC now. If it's not already at that C rating, then you should get the ball rolling with working on anything that can improve the energy efficiency of your property between now and 2025. And you can take a look at all of the detail there on any government website. So to talk about electrical safety now, a bit of a mouthful here. An electrical Installation condition report is what all landlords now have to serve on renters and ensure is in place before tenants move in. This piece of legislation was updated in the last few years, and if you have had a long sitting tenant, this piece of legislation does apply to you as well. So even if you've not found a new tenant in the last few years, make sure that you are fully aware of the requirements here. So this report should be conducted every 5 years by a qualified electrician, and it's really about making sure that all of the fuses, sockets, wiring, fuse board within the property is not going to harm your renters and is up to the current standards. So as I say, the tenants must be provided with a copy of this before they move in. And similarly, if there are any remedial works recommended by your electrician in order to bring the property up to the acceptable satisfactory rating, then those must be conducted within 28 days of the initial report. So just to touch on that again, the rating for an EICR is either satisfactory or unsatisfactory. It's a pretty common pitfall for landlords to fall into with providers, where a lot of remedials can be advised, but I'd advise taking a look at the detail there. What category is that remedial work falling into? As you can see here on the slide, we have the categories noted as C1 through 3. With the appropriate rating noted there. Take a look at the detail of the work that's being recommended to ensure that you're doing the work that is legally required in order to bring your property up to that satisfactory rating. And I'd just like to point out finally on EICRs is if you would like to get a comparable quote from your electrician to ensure that you're getting the best recommendation and price for your remedials, you can of course do that. A different electrician could carry out your remedial works for you and provide you with a certificate of the completion of those works. That in combination with your initial EICR allows you to satisfy the regulation. I've seen that as a common pitfall for lots of landlords, so worth noting. Okay, coming on to the How to Rent Guide. This is a pretty quick area of compliance. The How to Rent Guide, if you have not taken a look at it, I would advise you doing so. It's a government guide, usually refreshed every 6 to 12 months or so. It's a piece of documentation that must be provided to renters, particularly for those inexperienced renters or people moving to the UK for the first time. This is a really valuable document for them. It also has a more accessible version should your renters require that. You must serve it on renters to ensure that they have the full information about the process of renting, what's expected of them, and you as a landlord as well. It's very simple. You just attach it to your kind of handover or introduction to renters before move-in, and then you've satisfied this area of compliance. Okay, finally coming on to speaking about deposit registration. So this is a really big area of compliance with pretty much the most significant financial penalties should you fail to complete all aspects of it. So deposit registration schemes were introduced in order to allow landlords and renters that forum to have a dispute regarding the deposit should they need to, if they're not able to agree on deductions post move out between themselves. So it's a really valuable tool that I personally think has made the process of deposit release much fairer, much more transparent for landlords and tenants. So what are your requirements as a landlord? So to summarise, as soon as you receive the full deposit into your account, you have 30 days in order to get that registered with one of the 3 government approved schemes. If you're using a company like Homemade, you can of course opt for us to register the deposit on your behalf, and the same time frame applies to us. So we get that deposit registered with the scheme, and we must serve all of the 3 pieces of documentation upon the renter in order to complete the registration process. So those 3 key documents are the deposit registration certificate, an information leaflet about your chosen scheme, and then also some prescribed information for the renter. The final thing really to mention on deposit registration here is that there is a deposit cap. In line with the Tenant Fee Act, which we'll discuss later on in this slideshow, the deposit can be no more than 5 weeks' rent, where your annual rent is £50,000 or less, and up to a maximum of 6 weeks if your rent is more than £50,000. A point I'd like to highlight on that is that if you do agree any rent reduction with your renter, in line with renewal perhaps, then you will need to ensure that your deposit cap is now equivalent to that new 5 weeks of rent, and that you release any excess of funds to the renters within 21 days.
Just to call that out there, I believe I might have said 21 days in order to release the excess deposit. It's actually 28 days, so just want to make sure that that's correct there.
Hey, Rach, thank you so much for that. That was really helpful, very insightful. There's a few questions that have come off the back of it. First one, how much should I expect to pay across those various different certificates that I need to get as a landlord?
Okay, good question. So we'll start with an EPC. So you should expect to pay no more than, I would say, £30 for an EPC, bearing in mind that can last you for 10 years. So that's a pretty good price there. For your gas safety certificate, this is something that needs to be done every 12 months. I'd say about £60 is the market standard for renewing your gas safety certificate. With regards to your electrical safety certificate, so this will be your certification that's on the pricier side. It is often room dependent, but it's something that lasts you for 5 years, so
Okay.
it's not, you're not doing it as frequently. So to start with, I'd say about a one bed would be somewhere around £180 for a one bedroom EICR. And then with regards to alarms, my advice to landlords is, of course, you can get your electrician or your plumber to install those for you when they're there, maybe doing either of the other areas of compliance, but ordering alarms on Amazon and then fitting those yourself is probably going to be the most cost effective method.
Cool, makes sense, thank you. Second question, if there's a dispute on a deposit, who handles that for me?
So as long as you've registered the deposit with one of the 3 government approved schemes, you will get an adjudicator. So that's an impartial third party. They've been professionally trained in mediation, reviewing the evidence that each party will put together. But that's the beauty of the deposit scheme, is that you're able to get an adjudicator, a completely unbiased third party, to review all of that evidence and then make a decision for you.
Okay, thanks. And then the final question, if I ignore all of the advice that you've given today and don't follow compliance, what's the implications on that for me?
So, very good question, and hopefully you don't do that. But there are obviously criminal and civil penalties for most areas of compliance. Some of the most significant areas that carry criminal penalties are things like the gas safety legislation and also right to rent. So review each of those in detail. Obviously, fines can start anywhere from £5,000 up to £15,000. So please don't breach any areas of compliance. And just to mention, actually, last year was one of the highest amount of fines that were imposed on the industry from councils and the regulatory authorities. And actually, we've already had a really significant start to 2023 in terms of fines as well. So we're probably set to break that record again for the amount of fines that are going to be imposed upon landlords. So which makes, a webinar like this just so important.
Cool, fantastic. Thanks, Rach. Really helpful.
Okay, after having gone through those items, there's just one final other legal consideration I'd like to highlight. That is the smoke and carbon monoxide alarm regulations. So there is no requirement to serve anything along to the renters in regards to this, but I do advise having a certificate of the check. So what we mean when we talk about these regulations is that there is now a requirement for a smoke alarm and a carbon monoxide alarm to be present within the property, installed on every story of the home used as living accommodation, and in any room where there is a solid fuel burning appliance or a fixed combustion appliance. Getting smoke and carbon monoxide alarms is super easy. There's no requirement, as long as there's nothing detailed in your HMO license, for the property to have hardwired versus battery smoke alarms. So it's very easy to be compliant with this piece of legislation. The thing I think trips landlords up the most is the requirement to ensure that you have tested all of the alarms on the start date. That is the technical start date of the tenancy. So if you do have a renter who is moving in a few days later, they're coming from abroad, or you decide to do your inventory slightly earlier than the start date, don't forget about this requirement to ensure that the testing of the alarms happens in conjunction with the legal start date of the tenancy. And yeah, that's it with regards to the smoke and carbon monoxide alarm regulations. Moving on to our final important considerations, big areas of compliance and things that we just want to highlight. First and foremost, we will talk to you about the Tenant Fee Act. So this act was, there was a lot of content at the time when this act was being introduced. It completely changed the way that most letting agents operate, as it introduced a ban on most of the fees that agents were able to charge tenants when it comes to moving into the properties. For tenants, obviously it massively changed the dynamic. It made moving home much easier for renters. It's just about the rent and the deposit as opposed to potentially hundreds of pounds in fees. So just to talk about some of the key headlines from this act, which governs pretty much every process here at Homemade. It's a very important piece of legislation. So the deposit cap, the 5 weeks rent, we've touched on that already when we spoke about deposit registration. It also introduced something called the deadline for agreement, and I think this is something that you may not be aware of, but it's a really useful tool when progressing new renters. So the moment that a renter makes their 1 week holding payment, a 15-day deadline starts, by which you must have signed the tenancy agreement or agreed to extend that deadline mutually with the renters. I think for landlords and tenants, this really helps you progress through that limbo phase when you're going through the process with new renters, and it puts a legal deadline on when the contract must be signed. So all of your checks on referencing you will have wanted to have completed by this date, so that you know for sure you have a legal commitment from your renters for the next 12, 18, etc. months. And similarly for the renters, not only have they taken the property off the market, but they now have a new place to call home for the next 12 months or even longer. The Tenant Fee Act also introduced rules regarding the deposit that you can take in order to remove the property from the market. So this is different to the 5 week deposit you'll hold for the duration of the tenancy. The holding deposit is equivalent to 1 week's rent. That is the maximum that you can take from a renter, and that is to allow the time for you to go through referencing, signing of the contract, right to rent, etc. So those are kind of the key charges pre-move-in. Talking about things once your tenants are in situ is also really important with regards to this act. So if a tenant, for example, would like to conduct a tenant swap mid-tenancy, I'm sure lots of landlords on this webinar have been through that process before, where maybe one sharer needs to move out and would look for someone to replace them. There is a maximum of £50, including VAT, that you can charge for that process. And someone like Homemade, we can carry out that process for you with all of the appropriate referencing checks, right to rent and paperwork that would go along with that, but that is a process that can be paid for by the renters per the Tenant Fee Act. Similarly, there's a £50 maximum charge if a tenant were to lose their key or other similar security device and they need it to be replaced. So those two elements I think really help to highlight that this act is not all in the tenant's favour. It does allow you as a landlord to have some protection if you find yourself needing to replace keys because renters have lost them or misplaced them, etc. Similarly, there is the fee for late payment of rent. Per the Act, it is capped at 3% above the Bank of England base rate. So that is a useful tool for you to encourage renters to ensure their rent is paid in on time and help you with any collection issues that you may face. So yeah, this is with regards, the full information with regards to the Tenant Fee Act, and anything that falls outside of the things we've discussed here would be deemed a prohibited payment. Just to touch on prohibited payments there, they do carry a penalty for every time you request from a renter a charge that is not detailed on this list. So really ensure that in any communication with renters, when you're finding new renters or managing them yourself throughout the tenancy, that you keep it very clear what you will and won't be charging them for. Okay, so deeds of guarantee. So we spoke about guarantors a little bit earlier when we spoke about referencing. Once you've referenced your guarantor, and typically, just to touch on a question we had earlier to talk about affordability, you'd usually be looking for a higher threshold of affordability with a guarantor than you would with a tenant, something like times 40, times 42 I've seen in some instances, but the referencing provider that we use at Homemade looks for times 36. Of the annual rent. So when you've satisfied yourself that your guarantor passes the affordability, you will want to make sure that you have a deed of guarantee or a guarantor agreement in place. This is a really common step to miss as a landlord. You need to create that legal obligation for the guarantor to step in and be accountable for the legal responsibilities of the tenancy if the tenant is not able to fulfill them themselves. A good deed of guarantee would not include any specific term. A deed of guarantee would be in place as long as the tenancy is in place. So if you're drafting something like this yourself, make sure that you don't have any specific timeframes on it, because if the tenancy were to renew, you do want to make sure that the obligations of the guarantor renew alongside it. And yeah, apart from making sure that you have this piece of paperwork signed, it just outlines those responsibilities between yourself and the guarantor with regards to the tenancy. Okay, finally, coming along to speak about HMO licensing. So this is a really important area of compliance, and unfortunately it varies across London and outside of the UK as well. So your best source of truth for anything with regards to HMO licensing is going to be your local council's website. All of the boroughs across London will maintain a register and details of the rules regarding HMO licensing. Licenses typically fall into three categories: the mandatory licensing, which most people are very well versed on. Then you also have additional and selective licensing. For me personally, I do think that selective licensing can be a really common pitfall for landlords. Selective licensing can come into play at any time. You may have a tenancy that didn't require a license at the start, but because borough requirements change, you may now need to have a selective license. So it's something where I would really advise checking in on your local council's website throughout the term of the tenancy to ensure that you're staying up to date with any changes in requirements for your borough. Specifically, when you have a HMO license, it can include requirements to carry out fire safety risk assessments, serve additional documentation on renters, have things like hardwired smoke alarms, and just generally ensure that you're a fit and proper person able to manage the tenancy effectively. So it's a really big piece of legislation. You must complete these applications directly with the council and ensure that you're meeting all of the requirements of your licence to ensure your tenancy remains compliant.
Thanks for that, Rach. Really helpful. In a moment, we're going to do a Q&A session. But in the meantime, I'm just going to introduce you to Homemade and tell you a little bit about what we do and the services we have to offer. So Homemade was founded by a landlord who felt like the lettings company he used were expensive and didn't offer him a great quality of service. And this was typical of the industry, really. So we set up to offer a low-cost, fast and transparent service. We're now 6 years down the line and we're the partner of choice for the UK's largest landlords. You may recognise some of the names on here. We've got Greystar, Quintain Living, Legal and General, Get Living, to name just a few. So what we offer is a tenant fine service, and that's at £1,200 plus VAT as a flat fee. If your rent was £2,000 a month and the tenancy length is 2 years, that's the equivalent of a percentage fee of just 2.5%. We also have the property wallet, which is includes rent collection and provides landlords with an online portal which provides marketing data on their property and also holds all of your compliance documents plus any other documentation for each of your tenancies. This is for a cost of only 5% plus VAT. On top of this, we have our property management service where you can have complete peace of mind that everything is being handled for you and any property issues are taken care of. You can just sit back, relax, and let the rent come in. So how do we do this? 64% of renters now consider multiple boroughs when looking for a property to rent. And that's not just in their current location. So our centralised operating model allows us to deliver to the whole of London and also whilst maintaining that human touch. We don't believe that you as a landlord should cover the cost of a high street branch, so we've reinvented the model and passed those savings on to you. So we don't just put a property online and wait for people to call us. We proactively create demand by using various different channels to find you as your landlord great tenants. So we offer a full end-to-end service. That's from marketing your property online, taking professional photos and floor plans, conducting viewings with our sales associate team who are out on the road across the whole of London, speaking with great renters. We negotiate all of the offers on your behalf. And then once an offer's agreed, we take a deposit and we can do all of the deposit handling for you and handle all of the paperwork right up to move in. So that includes due diligence, referencing and contracting. We're always looking to innovate and improve our service for landlords and tenants, so we fully digitise the process, allowing us to speed up every part of the lettings process for you as tenants and as landlords. So why us? Well, we're faster, we're proactive, we have a digitised customer service with a highly skilled team behind it, and we offer an advanced personal service to cater for your needs.
Thanks for that, Sam. We'll now go over to the questions that have come in from you guys during the webinar.
Great. So first question comes from Anna242. Her question is, how much do you think a reference check costs?
Good question. So I think a reasonable referencing provider would charge you anywhere between £10 to £15 for a reference. Obviously, there is a variety of providers out there on the market. So do have a look at the one that's going to best suit your criteria. And from a good referencing provider, I would also expect the guarantor reference, if there was one included as part of the tenancy, to come under that £10 to £15 per tenant cost.
Great. And so then the next question is a question from Paul Harrow. Should you run reference checks on all guarantors?
Good question, Paul. Absolutely. So you're going to want to check that the guarantor meets the affordability and also that they're fully engaged in the process. So setting the guarantor expectations in advance to make sure they know what's required of them when it comes to referencing. And then later on, the deed of guarantee is a very good idea. So yes, absolutely, you will want to reference a guarantor. Okay.
The next question is from Landlord John. What changes are coming up for MEES? MEES are minimum energy efficiency standards. And there's a similar question from Sylvia H, which is what are the changes coming up for EPCs?
Yep, so we touched on it a little bit during the webinar, but the changes that are coming up is that in 2025, later on in the year, within 2025, the minimum energy standard is going up to a C rating. Worth pointing out, though, that there has been some discussion that the this date might be delayed until 2028.
Okay. Another question from Heidi. Is there a reliable place to find a list of nationalities that require right to rent?
Yes, there absolutely is. But just to point out initially that every renter or permitted occupier, or anyone who's going to be living in the property that is over 18 does require a right to rent check. So it's not specific to certain nationalities. However, there is a really handy government guide. If you just pop into Google, right to rent users guide, you should be able to find the government approved one, and that goes into all of the detail about the kind of documents that you can accept to satisfy a right to rent check.
Great. Next question is from Katie. Do gas safety certificates need to be one per tenant or one per household?
So you definitely want one for the entire household. So yeah, it's just one that you get issued for your property, regardless of the number of tenants that there are.
Great. And then a second question from Katie, which is, do carbon monoxide and smoke alarms need to be tested each year? And how do you prove that you've tested them?
Okay, so I'll start with the proving first. Very simple, put together a descriptive, concise certificate template, the date of the check, perhaps the people that were present, sign it, and also, have all of the relevant details about the tenants. So that's how you can produce a certificate. It's actually quite straightforward. In terms of the ongoing testing, your tenants will be responsible, and that usually is contained within your tenancy agreement, for replacing batteries or reporting any faults with the alarms. However, worth pointing out that if you do have a HMO license, there could be additional requirements and onus on you as the landlord to ensure that those are tested, sometimes even weekly. So if you are a HMO landlord, have a look at the details in your license.
Cool. I just had another question come in, which is from Martin. What is the name of the EICR remedy doc, and how does the landlord recognise it?
Good question. I think that's probably one that we'll have to go into more detail on in another webinar. EICRs are super complex. It's something that you want to make sure that you have all of the right information on. The regulations change really frequently. So yeah, let's save that for another webinar.
All right, fantastic. Next question is from Helen G. If there's a deposit dispute, who arbitrates and what happens if I need to challenge it?
So if there is a deposit dispute, first of all, I would like to point out it's always preferable to try and agree with your renters outside of the scheme. But if there is a dispute, it's going to be dealt with by one of the 3 government approved schemes, and their decision is legally binding. So that's why I really put emphasis on trying to agree outside of the scheme, because once you do enter into that arbitration process, you will have to stick with the decision that's made.
Okay, and then another question from Helen, which is how much does it oh sorry, no, we've done that one, my apologies. Last question is from BGC. Would a property management company cover off all compliance?
Absolutely. A good property management company will run you through all of the checks for everything that you need to allow your renters to move in. And they'll also help you monitor ongoing compliance, make sure you renew things like your gas safety and your EICR, also walk you through any renewal paperwork. If you do have an existing property management company, I would advise having a look over the terms of business, check where the liabilities lie. But absolutely a good property management company like Homemade would cover off all of this for you.
Great. Thanks, Rach. That's all we have time for, unfortunately. Thank you so much for your questions and for joining us. If your question wasn't answered or you want to discuss anything with us, then please drop us an email on marketing@home-made.com. We're going to run similar webinars to this one across a variety of different subjects. Please look out for emails on those. And if you have any requests, please send those in. Thanks to Steve and to Pete, our lovely marketing team who are behind the camera. And thanks again to you guys for joining. I hope it's been beneficial to you. Have a nice evening in the sun, and we'll speak soon.